This will be our continuation of the introduction and overview for the Cambridge World History, Volume 1, Introducing World History to 10,000 BCE, edited by David Christian, and the introduction overview section is by David Christian. Conventionally, the Middle Paleolithic in Europe begins with the appearance of Neanderthalensis. Neanderthals evolved in Europe from Heidelbergensis ancestors at least by around 250,000 years ago. They were apparently well adapted to glacial conditions because, unlike other hominins, they were able to remain in Europe even in periods of extreme glacial climates. Analysis of Neanderthal bones showed that they depended largely on meat from large herbivores such as mammoth. Surprisingly, though, there is no evidence of sewn clothing or of the ability to make fire, though there is plenty of evidence that they could maintain fires. And actually, there is, if you look at the Museum of Natural History, evidence that Neanderthalensis might have made flutes from animal bones as well. Their stone tools, however, were sophisticated and have long been used as a marker for the beginning of the Middle Paleolithic from about 300,000 years ago. Neanderthalensis might also, if you read Everett's book from Oxford called The Invention of Language, he goes into the fact that Neanderthalensis might have actually had language acquisition as well. It has recently been shown that Neanderthals could also make composite tools with multiple parts that were joined using sophisticated adhesives. Unfortunately, we have little understanding of the Neanderthal mind. They probably buried some of their dead, though that in itself is not necessarily proof of a belief in an afterlife. Though they possess a gene which seems to be important for human speech, as I have said, the objects they made changed a little over 200,000 years, which seems to suggest that they lacked the rich creativity associated with modern human languages. The Upper Paleolithic in Europe is conventionally, if somewhat anachronistically, associated with the appearance of our own species, Homo sapiens. The evidence is now overwhelming that modern humans evolved in Africa. Some members of our own species actually appeared in Europe about 50,000 years ago, and Neanderthals may have vanished within 10,000 years of that date. And so there was some coexistence or possibly peaceable relations, or not so peaceable relations between probably our species and that of Neanderthalensis. There might have been some mating and interbreeding that went on as well. There was now clear evidence of some interbreeding between the species, probably about 100,000 years ago, when modern humans and Neanderthals lived near each other in the Near East. But the differences between them remains unclear, and the remains that are left behind by modern humans and Neanderthals are immense and significant, and they almost certainly arise from the appearance of modern human language, a fully syntactic language with phrase structure, grammar, and potentially infinite variety of sentences and narratives. This change, Hofecker argues, marks the advent of the modern mind. Modern humans reached Europe from the Near East through the Caucasus or across the Bosphorus, and probably during a warm period. From 42,000 years ago, we find evidence for proto-Aurignacian industries, which is an industry, if you go back and look at our readings in archaeology, you'll see the Aurignacian industry, and it shows the sort of diversity clearly characteristic of modern humans. Remains include eyed needles and hair traps, as well as rich artistic products, including an ivory carving, the Löwenmensch from Germany, which seems to depict a semi-human figure of myth. Some of these cultures are associated with an extremely cold spell, suggesting that modern humans rapidly developed technologies that were appropriate for glacial conditions. Evidence for technological innovation multiplies between 30,000 and 25,000 years ago in the Gravettian period. Large settlements in Central and Eastern Europe suggest improved food-producing technologies, and some sites even contain ovens hot enough to make ceramics. The extreme cold of the late glacial maximum forced the abandonment of many more northerly sites as ice sheets spread over large parts of northern Europe for several thousand years. Then after 20,000 years ago, more northerly sites were reoccupied by representatives of the Magdalenian and Epigravettian cultures. By 12,000, there is evidence of large partly permanent settlements, some with houses made of mammoth bones. Here, as in the Near East, China, and also parts of North Africa, we see cultural and technological changes that seem to hint at the early stages of a shift towards agriculture. In Chapter 17, Robin Donnell describes Paleolithic migrations into Asia, which also began in Africa and passed through the Near Eastern bottleneck. Like Hofecker, Donnell stresses the importance of climate change in shaping the history of the Paleolithic era. Donnell's chapter tells a story of two major hominin dispersals. Out of Africa 1, which is the most ancient hominin dispersal from almost 2 million years ago, and out of Africa 2, the dispersal of Homo sapiens within the last 100,000 years. The earliest evidence of hominins living outside of Africa has been found at Dmanisi Cave in Georgia, where the remains of early forms of Homo erectus, or working man, erectus meaning the man who stands upright, have been found and date to 1.77 million years ago. Though their brains were about half the size of those of modern humans, their use of stone tools suggests increasing dependence on meat and marrow in their diets. Indeed, these technologies, which presumably gave access to more food energy, may explain the first dispersals outside of Africa. Other early finds in Asia include skeletal remains of Sangrian, Java, from around 1.5 million years ago, and hominin artifacts from North China. Anyways, Java is an Indonesian archipelago, and these date from about 1.66 million years ago, coupled with evidence from Atapuerca in northern Spain from around 1.3 million years ago. These show that hominins could be found throughout Eurasia to a latitude of about 40 degrees north by about 1.5 million years ago. But as Donnell points out, the evidence is so thin that a single find or a slight improvement in the precision of dating techniques could easily force us to rethink both the geography and the timing of these early dispersals. It also is clear that the existing evidence provides a tiny sample of multiple dispersals and retreats, including perhaps reverse dispersals back into Africa, coming out of Africa to Eurasia. And so the story out of Africa too is the story of our own species, Homo sapiens, and its dispersals from Africa. There's a broad consensus that remains dated to 190,000 years ago from the Awash Valley in Ethiopia belonging to Homo sapiens. Modern human remains are found first outside of Africa in modern Israel, where they date to about 125,000 to 70,000 years ago, but this population seems to have been displaced by Neanderthals sometime before 70,000 years ago, presumably as a result of climatic deterioration. Between 40,000 years ago and 60,000 years ago, there were new dispersals of modern humans from Africa, and these took our ancestors to Southeast Asia, New Guinea, and Australia. The earliest evidence of these dispersals is associated with Middle Stone Age technologies similar to those of Neanderthalensis, and based on the removal of flakes from specially prepared cores. And of course, like the Out of Africa 1 story, this story also rests on limited evidence and could easily be transformed by more evidence. For example, the discovery of new skeletal remains in the Levant and Southeast Asia before 125,000 years ago would suggest, as Peter Hiscock will argue in Chapter 18, that there may have been a successful earlier dispersal of modern humans from the Levant to South and Southeast Asia. As evidence of ancient climate changes improves, it is tempting to think that we can link what we know of early human dispersals to the erratic climate changes of the ice ages. There were large cycles of change driven by the Milankovic cycles, but also shorter, more erratic, and more abrupt changes such as the Heinrich events, which were cold snaps that could last for centuries or even millennia. In warmer and more humid periods, human populations could settle further north, while in colder and drier periods, populations probably contracted south, and some groups may have been isolated from other populations for long periods of time. This means that there must, in practice, have been many different periods of advance and retreat, few of which have been left behind, leaving behind direct evidence. In Tajikistan in Central Asia, we have direct evidence that modern humans arrived only in warmer periods, and evidence from China and Britain hints at similar patterns. Changing technologies also shaped early hominin dispersals. Stone tools, which gave humans access to a meat-rich diet, probably enabled the earliest migrations into colder regions. As Chapter 8 argues, a meat-rich diet combined with a shrinking of the human gut may also help explain the rapid increase in brain size capacity in the last few million years. And as brain size correlates closely with group size in most primates, larger brains may imply larger social groups, more sharing of information, and the evolution of a social brain that would have widened the potential scope for hominins to disperse into new types of environments or to utilize them more effectively. In Asia, the impact of new technologies is most apparent in the last 50,000 years. We see little evidence for any widening of the hominin range over a million years. Then, within the last 50,000 years, the range widens fast. Siberia was probably colonized from 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, bringing humans to the Ice Age land bridge of Beringia, from which some would eventually cross into the Americas. And thus we have hominins into the Americas from the Ice land bridge of Beringia, and then also Australia as well. And so Australia was colonized at least 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Peter Hiscock will give evidence for even earlier dates in chapter 18. And Japan by 40,000 years ago. And so both these dispersals required significant navigational skills, however. Rainforests of Southeast Asia were also occupied by 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. Finally, the Tibetan Plateau was occupied right at the end of the last Ice Age. The evidence from Asia then points to a very significant inflection in the human history of Asia from about 50,000 years ago with the arrival of modern humans. And as has been said in chapter 18, Peter Hiscock surveys recent evidence on the history of Australia in the Paleolithic era. During cooler periods of the Ice Ages, sea levels were low enough for Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania to be linked with a single paleocontinent known as Sahul that was separated from the Ice Age peninsula of Sunda, Indonesia, by deep water. Debates about the earliest colonization of Australia do affect how we interpret the earlier migrations of modern humans out of Africa. The dominant model has modern humans leaving Africa as late as 60,000 to 65,000 years ago, and assumes that finds of modern humans in the Near East before 90,000 years represents a false start, an interpretation that we have encountered already in chapters 14, 16, and 17. Of course, this model requires rapid migrations through South Asia to Australia if it is to fit with the best dates for the colonization of Australia. For example, it has been suggested that we should imagine a migration of peoples who stayed close to the coasts, exploring coastal resources and developing their seagoing skills en route to Australia. The late dispersion model also encouraged skepticism about any dates for Australian settlement earlier than about 45,000 years ago. Hiscock argues that recent evidence undermines the late dispersal model. Genetic research suggests that human mutation rates may have been slower than has often been assumed, which is consistent with alternative models in which Australian populations diverged from African populations as early as 120,000 years ago. And perhaps early migrations from Africa were not false starts, but the actual beginnings of successful dispersals that have left little trace. Of course, recent genetic evidence also points to genetic exchanges, analogous to those in Europe with the Neanderthalensis, between modern humans from an early dispersal and populations of other hominin species, including the Denisovan populations that have been just identified in 2010 from remains in a Siberian cave whose ancestors had left Africa over 500,000 years ago. This allows the possibility that instead of racing from the Near East to Australia, the populations whose descendants eventually colonized Australia may have been a range that was ranged widely with Eurasia in a more leisurely dispersal before reaching Australia. The absence of Denisovan genes from modern East Asian populations also just suggests that Australia was colonized by an earlier wave of modern humans, and East Asia by a later wave that displaced Denisovan populations. Finally, the presence of similar genetic lineages in both modern and ancient Australian populations suggests that most modern indigenous Australians are descended from a single early wave of colonization. An early dispersal model aligns well with archaeological evidence at the time, suggesting that humans had arrived in Australia at least by 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Rock shelters in Arnhem Land in northernmost Australia contain artifacts that have been dated by thermoluminescence dating, which we cover in our archaeology series, to as early as 67,000 years ago. Though such early dates have been questioned, there is firm evidence that humans were present in many parts of Sahul by 50,000 years ago, and to have spread so widely they must have arrived well before that date. The earliest human skeletal remains in Australia come from Lake Mungo in southern Australia and date to about 43,000 years ago. Mitochondrial DNA extracted from a Lake Mungo skeleton is similar enough to modern Australian Aboriginal DNA to show that they belong to the same lineage, which suggests that there were no major colonizations after the founding wave. By 45,000 to 55,000 years ago, humans already occupied a great variety of environments and biomes, including sandy and rocky deserts, semi-arid grasslands and savannas, as well as uplands, tropical regions, and woodlands, and there is plenty of evidence for distinctive regional cultures. The disappearance of many large-bodied species at about the time of the arrival of humans may have been a result of human overhunting, though the absence of kill sites, in contrast to the Americas, where they are extremely abundant, weakens such interpretations of that in Australia. A period of cooler, drier climates also may have played a role in these extinctions, but whatever the cause, the removal of many large herbivores must have transformed the environment. For example, it would have allowed the accumulation of large amounts of fuel and increased the likelihood of natural firing of the land. From about 45,000 years ago until the late glacial maximum, Sahul underwent a great drying. Sea levels dropped, exposing new exploitable regions along the continent's shorelines, while the interior became drier and many lakes vanished. Changing conditions generated new technologies, some adapted to dry conditions, some making use of ground seeds. Evidence of long-distance exchanges over many hundreds of kilometers suggests the importance of extensive networks in drier environments. And between 25,000 and 18,000 years ago, during the late glacial maximum, oceans dropped to 125 meters below their current level, and climates became exceptionally dry and cold. Glaciers formed in some upland regions, and the land area of Sahul reached its largest extent. Many older archaeological sites were abandoned, and even bodies adapted, becoming larger and more robust than the bodies of later populations. And from about 19,000 to 10,000 years ago, climates began to warm up erratically and sea levels began to rise from 125 meters below today's sea levels to just 20 meters below 10,000 years ago. Australia's land area shrank by a third. Along Australia's northern borders, shorelines retreated as much as 1,000 kilometers, as once occupied lands were drowned, forcing groups to migrate and rearrange their territories. Tasmania was separated from the mainland, as was New Guinea. The changes of this period were so erratic that ecology seemed not to have stabilized until the Holocene period, and not until the last 3,000 to 4,000 years were climate stable enough to allow more specialized and intensive systems of exploitation to emerge, systems that may parallel developments in the Near East before the first appearance of agriculture. In Chapter 19, Nicole Vogsbach describes the Paleolithic colonization of the Americas, a landmass even larger and more varied than that of Australia. Humans reached the Americas through the harsh environments of northeastern Eurasia, which explains why the Americas were occupied after the late glacial maximum. Even if Siberia was colonized temporarily from as early as 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, which is discussed in Chapter 17, more permanent Siberian settlements appear only around 18,000 years ago. At the late glacial maximum, North America's major ice sheets may have merged, blocking movements from Beringia southwards. But after the coldest period, a corridor opened between major ice sheets, which may have allowed travel along the Yukon and Mackenzie River valleys into the Americas. Colonists may also have moved through Beringia and around the Pacific coastline. There is little doubt that humans entered the Americas from northeastern Siberia, or that some had arrived by 14,500 years ago. However, evidence on the founder populations is thin enough to generate heated debates about the exact chronology and geography of their arrival. Many forms of evidence show that the first human communities in the Americas were highly nomadic and dispersed over large areas, and this itself may explain the scanty archaeological record that they left behind. It also makes it likely that many groups left no trace at all. Sporadic traces of such groups may help explain the large number of claims for earlier arrivals. Sites that may or might eventually provide evidence for occupation before 15,000 years ago include Monteverde in Chile, Pedra Furada in Brazil, and Meadowcroft in Pennsylvania, and Buttermilk Creek in Texas in the United States of America. Before the 1920s, it was still possible to argue either that the Americas were occupied very recently or that human occupation was as ancient as in the Old World or that of Europe. The discovery of Paleolithic sites in the western United States, beginning with the Folsom site in 1927, provided the first clear evidence of early human arrivals. From the middle of the 20th century, radiometric dating eventually helped clarify the chronology of American sites and material culture there. The earliest period of human occupation of the Americas is now described as Paleo-Indian. Cultural, social, and technological continuities explain why that period extends into the Holocene, ending with the appearance of new toolkits and signs of sedentism during the period known as the Archaic, which conventionally begins from around 8,000 BCE. American Paleo-Indian archaic cultures were highly mobile and produced distinctive stone tools. The best-known Paleo-Indian cultural tradition is the Clovis tradition, named after a distinctive type of projectile point first found near Clovis, New Mexico. Up to 4,000 similar points have been found in an area reaching from Canada to Mexico, often associated with the remains of large herbivores such as mammoth. And we're talking about all the way from the northern tips of Northern America to the southern tips of Mesoamerica. And most date from within about 600 years of 13,500 years ago. These and the later Folsom stone points are the only known stone tool traditions with fluted points. Most Clovis sites are kill sites, sometimes associated with campsites. Many signs point to the mobility of Clovis foragers. They include the absence of large grindstones and the presence of tools made from stone quarried hundreds of kilometers from where they were found. High mobility may help explain why the first populations in the Americas rapidly colonized large areas. As in Australia, the arrival of efficient hunters in a continent whose megafauna had no experience of humans may help to explain the disappearance of many of their species from about 13,000 years ago. We know that Clovis peoples hunted megafauna. We also know that large species are vulnerable to overhunting because they reproduce slowly. But, as in Australia, it is also possible that rapid climate change played a role in the disappearance of many species of megafauna. The sudden cold snap of the Younger Dryas period coincided quite closely with America's megafaunal extinctions. The hypothesis of a rapid spread of highly mobile Clovis peoples throughout the Americas, which dominated thinking from the 1930s and the 1960s, has recently been questioned, however. Some archaeologists see Clovis cultures as an inland development, quite distinct from other colonizing groups that specialized in shoreline resources and moved along coastal routes that we no longer see because they were drowned as sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age. And, of course, the paucity of skeletal remains from this period adds to the difficulty of clarifying such issues. At present, early Paleo-Indian cultures are represented by the remains of fewer than 10 individuals. And as with much of the archaeology of the Paleolithic era, the available evidence is sparse enough that a single discovery could indeed transform our understanding of the early colonization of the Americas. And as the chapters in part 2 of this volume demonstrate, the Paleolithic history of our species is coming into sharper focus, and that makes it more important to integrate Paleolithic history more fully within modern world history scholarship, teaching, and research. New techniques, including radiometric dating, genetic comparisons, and increasingly precise ways of tracking climate change, have allowed the construction of a clearer account of the vast periods of time between the evolution of our species 7 million years ago and the emergence of agricultural societies early in the Holocene epoch, around 8,000 years ago. And as we have seen, dates for the evolution of fully modern humans are still contested. The dates adopted in this volume range from almost 200,000 years ago to as late as 70,000 years ago. The chapters in this volume also differ on the significance of early human dispersals from Africa. Modern humans seem to have been present in the Levant 100,000 years ago. But precisely how modern were they? And was that dispersal a false start? or the first step in migrations that eventually led our ancestors into much of Europe, Asia, and eventually Australia. But if the precise chronologies are contested, the main lines of the story are now much more clearer than they were a generation ago. We are an African species, but our ancestors displayed such ecological and technological creativity that they were able to occupy lands in all the continents apart from Antarctica by the end of the Paleolithic era. And we're talking about all biomes on the face of the globe. The remarkable and distinctive history of our species began deep in the Paleolithic era, but we can also see that the migrations themselves came in pulses, only some of which are visible in the archaeological record. Those pulses were shaped in part by climate change, and during colder, drier phases, deteriorating climates checked and even reversed migrations, and inhabited regions were abandoned, often to be reoccupied again, sometimes with new technologies, once conditions improved. The migratory pulses were also shaped by our ancestors' technological creativity and by the slow accumulation of new techniques and new ecological and social understanding, so that, despite the checks and reversals, our ancestors eventually occupied environments ranging from tropical forests to the tundras of Siberia and North America. These Paleolithic movements laid the foundations for everything that would follow in the Holocene history of our species. In our next reading, we will cover part 1, historiography, method, and themes. And so we're going to talk about writing world history, and this is going to be this chapter is by Marnie Hughes Warrington, who wrote the preface for the Cambridge World History. She writes on writing world history, and obviously she's going to go over on historiography and historical method as well as themes in world history.